Welcome to Feminist Question Time, brought to you by Women's Declaration International, the leading global organization defending women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. There's more information on the website, womensdeclaration.com, where you'll find our Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, which has been signed by 31,310 people from 159 countries and is supported by 441 organizations. We have over 100 volunteer activists, including 53 country contact, engaged in defending women's rights. This week, we have Sue England, who's originally from the UK but lives in Germany, who will talk about why legal cases have become so important in the fight and ask what went wrong with democracy. Nina from Canada, who will talk about how employment equity is undermined by self-ID in Canada. Andrea Nobre from Brazil, who is a journalist, feminist campaigner, and the author of The Grumpy Guide to Radical Feminism and The Grumpy Guide to Motherhood, talking about motherhood in a patriarchal system. I will turn it over to Sue England. Welcome, Sue.
I'm talking about the fact that, as well as all the sort of normal political campaigning for this movement to try and protect women's rights, why has there been such a recent emphasis on court cases? Well, obviously, the simple answer to that is that you do everything that you can to try and push your project forward to create these protections. But there has been a particular emphasis on this, particularly in the UK recently. And increasingly, there are cases in America as well. And I think a large number of cases will come on stream there. We'll certainly have more cases in the UK too. So I'm going to briefly talk about, well, why have we moved in that direction? Obviously, especially when people are asked to crowdfund, it's like seems to be large amounts of money. But on the other hand, we have to bear in mind that it always needs a lot of money, as much as possible, to actually be politically campaigning. But this, for many people, is a new route, getting involved in court cases and particularly funding them. So why have we found ourselves in this position? Well, because democracy is failing us in many respects. This is despite the fact that women in many countries have the vote now, which enables us to use the democratic process. I mean, and if you look globally, if the population of China and India is excluded because they have far fewer women than men, because of sex-selective abortion and infanticide, in the rest of the world, there are more females than males. So in most democratic countries, women make up a majority of the voting population, and they live longer, and older people vote more than the young. This creates a permanent majority for women under the democratic system. This is dangerous for men. And it seems at present, no political movement in most countries, including our own, can actually get young people to vote. That is a thing we might think about further. Are we getting young people who would vote for us to the polls when they don't normally go to the polls? But in general, women have the numerical advantage. We could have a huge impact simply by using our vote in a normal democratic process. So moving on from that, for the first time since the Second World War, there's been an extensive global operation to roll back human rights and human rights in general. It was fairly obvious that women were going to be attacked first, to be removed as a political force, because we are very numerous, but a weaker group, and we do vote. So if they can knock us out, very useful indeed. Most of our politicians are quite aware of this and are hopeless in dealing with this, and this issue about gender, the gender identity movement. We've all heard, I hope by now, about the Dentons lobbying advice document. They gave advice to the gender identity movement globally. It's awful to read, but it is actually standard advice to political movements who have lots of money and no scruples. Their advice, of course, is make links that are as hidden as possible with politicians and the people who work inside government organizations. Write the first draft of any proposal you've got, any initiative. That's always the first rule of lobbying. I've done some lobbying myself. It's the first rule of lobbying. Write the first draft. And ideally, you do this before anybody who might oppose it has even heard about it, and get it out there. You must avoid debate or drown out debate with louder voices, with lots of money, wherever possible. So this is actually what the lobbying industry always does. And also we know politicians know that too. So that is why currently we are on the back foot, as well as, you know, a general problem with women not being so fully represented in politics, political activity. So I won't spend any more time on that, but this is a crucial reason why our fight to protect women's rights has opened up another front. We are focusing on existing law and taking legal cases. This gives us another forum, a public forum, where we can challenge what's happening while the politicians are so often avoiding us and cutting us out of the political space. And also we have to realize that a lot of earlier feminist work was on changing the laws. We had to change the laws to get ourselves fully covered by them. Now we have laws to actually defend. The field has changed to that extent. Women have gained access to full human rights since the Second World War. It's accepted under international law that women should have full access to human rights along with men without any discrimination. This is and has had a major impact through many parts of the world, particularly the more democratic parts of the world. It's a major new development in historical terms, but also it means we've got a foundation of rights to actually use. We've got them, many of them. We don't have to, you know, we're being attacked because we've got them. Okay. It's also been clear to me for a long time that this attempt to attack this post-war consensus around human rights would involve bringing back religion and cults. It started with several of the existing, you know, large religions 30 years or so ago in many places, and it's spreading. And we all know what's happening in Russia, India, Poland, the USA itself, of course, and we can probably think of other examples. These are all countries where religion still had a lot of power, the existing religions, so bring them back, make them more powerful, challenge this secular post-Enlightenment idea of everybody having the same universal human rights. But of course, religion's been rolled back in many countries, so a new cult was needed, particularly in those countries where that has actually been happening. And thus we see what has appeared, particularly in what probably many people here feel we're living in the more democratic countries. Well, then we need something new to fight that. You can't push people back to the older religions. So looking on from that, the reality is we have got established rights in many, many texts, and we've got many, many laws which give us these rights too in our own countries. The drive of these cults is to undermine the rule of law. They don't want Enlightenment principles, and they are completely unconcerned with the fact that these laws have been brought into effect in most places by democratic means. So this is where we are at the moment. We're so used to critiquing the law and urging changes to it to improve it for women. We now have discovered that we're in a situation where we need to fully appreciate and use what we already have to ensure the rule of our existing laws, to ensure the rule of law, and to protect what we've gained. So this feeds into this idea of bringing many legal cases. And as most people know, a lot of legal cases have already been brought in the UK in the last few years and are happening all the time. And as I say, will maybe start in other countries, will certainly be starting in the USA. So to give people some helpful information today, I thought I would look at some of the cases that there have been, mainly in the UK and also one in the US. I'll be doing this very briefly because I'll be quoting from some of the judgments and some of the really useful things which have been put in judgments in these cases. And so just before I start running through them, it'll be very quick. I want to point out that both countries, the UK and the US, now have a Supreme Court, because previously the British had a different name for their highest court. So I'm talking here initially about two different Supreme Courts, one in the US and one in the UK. So looking at a case in 2016, what was this about? In the UK, it went to the UK Supreme Court and it was successful. The applicants successfully challenged the compulsory appointment by the state, in this case, it was the Scottish Government, of a named person, an official, as it were, to look after and control all sorts of issues concerning every child in the country. Fortunately, it was successful. It was held that this new law breached the rights of the parents of children under, in fact, the European Convention on Human Rights. But it was held, it was the UK Supreme Court that decided this. If it had stood, it was completely wiped out. It would have created a massive interference in the relationship between parents and their children, an enormous state control over every aspect of family life where there were children. So wonderfully, in the Supreme Court judgment, they say this, and I'm quoting: "The first thing that a totalitarian regime tries to do is to get at the children, to distance them from the subversive, varied influences of their families, and to indoctrinate them in their ruler's view of the world." Now that's quite a statement to put in a Western court judgment, isn't it? But as you can see, this is where these 5 judges situated this. This is how they saw the overall effect of this new law, and they struck it down. Totalitarianism, they thought, we are looking at with this piece of legislation. And as well, they also said the relationship between parent and child is an integral part of family life. Family life covers a broad range of parental rights and responsibilities with regard to the care and upbringing of children enabling parents to take important decisions on their behalf. And this human right, Article 8 it was, protects the rights of parents to exercise such parental authority. This case was actually brought by the Christian Institute and other pressure groups in Scotland. And as I say, they were completely successful. But also in the judgment, the UK Supreme Court quotes a US Supreme Court case. And this goes back to 1925. So I'm sure Cara will know all about this. And this case said, right back in 1925, families must be left to bring up their children in their own way. And in particular, an exact quote from this is, the fundamental theory of liberty upon which all governments in this union, they mean the United States, repose, excludes any general power of the state to standardize its children by forcing them to accept instruction from public teachers only. The child is not the mere creature of the state. Those who nurture him, sorry about the old-fashioned terminology, and direct his destiny have the right, coupled with the high duty, to recognize and prepare him for additional obligations. This is powerful stuff. You can always obviously date many of these things by the particular terminology, but the idea is the same. So both Supreme Courts say in binding judgments, there's an inextricable link between the protection of the family and the protection of fundamental freedoms in liberal democracies, as opposed to, of course, totalitarian systems. Now, in 2020, there was another case in the UK, and this is called the McConnell case, because that was the name of the woman who had become a holder of a UK gender recognition certificate and then had a child. She went to the UK courts and asked to be registered as the father of this child, or she suggested she could also be called the parent or a gestational parent on the birth certificate. And what did the UK court say? They said, substituting a word such as parent for the word mother is completely inappropriate. It's a decision, if it was to be made, for society through Parliament. Here, the court saying, we step back. We're living in a parliamentary democracy. All things shouldn't be decided by us, a court. In fact, it should be decided by Parliament, after all the proper democratic processes. Fortunately, this was the end of this case. So that was an important decision in British law, and the word mother is protected. And what they actually said, here's a quote, "We don't have evidence before this court as to how other members of society would feel if they were no longer going to be referred to on their child's birth certificate as a mother or as a father, but simply as parent one or parent two." These were among the possible ways forward which was suggested by the applicant. In our view, this illustrates how inept the subject matter, this idea of changing these fundamental ideas, is for determination by the courts as compared to Parliament. And then the third case is the Forstater case, which is, the judgment is June 2021, so we're coming right up to date. And this was decided in the UK by Mr. Justice Chowdhury, who is in the Employment Appeal Tribunal. And here is what he said and what has been ruled. The Gender Recognition Act, which is 2004, which is the only piece of legislation about this in the UK, does not compel a person to believe something that they do not believe. And the court also ruled, he ruled, this belief that you don't have to believe that somebody has changed sex, this belief is one worthy of respect in a democratic society. And also he's saying there must be full freedom of speech in a democratic society. He goes on to say, which is another useful quote, there's evidence that this gender critical belief is not unique to her, this is Maya Forstater, but is widely shared, including amongst respected academics. They actually had Professor Kathleen Stock giving evidence to them. The popularity of a belief does not necessarily insulate it from being one that gravely undermines the rights of others. History is replete with instances where large swathes of society have succumbed to philosophies that seek to destroy the rights of others. However, any widely shared belief demands particular care. We will not easily condemn it. Most beliefs are worthy of respect in a democratic society. You have to go a long way to show that you have beliefs which are going to damage other people's rights in a democratic society. So again, he's talking about the risks of totalitarianism. He also goes on, I'm coming to the end soon.
Great, thank you.
He's also saying that this belief is consistent with law. And it would be absolutely jarring to say that somebody's beliefs, which are in line with law created by your society, can be overridden. His wording actually meant, he said, I think this is absurd and dangerous. So as just the cases I've quoted from, that covers 9 judges, male, 2 women. So even the men can work out what's happening here, okay? So I want to wind up by saying, at the broadest level, the UK judges are really clear about what's happening here, how dangerous and extensive the aims of the gender identity cult are. And they have made rulings which back this up. We must use them. And my final point is, this is why the work of tribunal tweets is so crucial and so helpful. Millions of people are now becoming aware of these issues through this process of taking them to courts. And this is enormously helpful. Imagine if tribunal tweets had already been operating in 2016 when the Scottish case was decided, but they are working now and they're doing a tremendous job, and we must all use this legal route as much as possible.
Do you want to quickly say what tribunal tweets is for women who may not know?
Oh yeah, sure. So in the UK, because you are allowed to go to court cases, I mean, it's to be in public. So what's happening is you can get a voice feed of what goes on in the court. You can't record it, but you can hear, because of Zoom and everything, rather than actually having to be in the court. So lots of people can hear what's going on. But tribunal tweets go and they act like reporters. They sit there in a rota and somebody types down everything that's happened. So we have a written record of everything that the witnesses said and all the questions they were asked. So it's not like an official court transcript, but it nearly is. So we're doing this now for these important cases. Loads of people are reading it on Twitter, but then also you can come back later and journalists come back. And because, and use it. And because of course we've had such this trouble with journalists not having the money and time to cover issues, it's even feeding back into the mainstream media, because a journalist doesn't have to sit there for 6 days, which they won't, but they can read the tribunal tweets version of what went on, and then they can put it in the newspaper as well. It's a really wonderful new invention. And they've had, like, the last couple, I can't remember if I said this in the speech, but they said they'd had Maya Forstatter's, something like 25 million people around the world had taken notice. And the last one that's just finished, is just finishing up this week, it was over 30 million people who'd you know, connected with it in some way. They wouldn't have sat there and listened to the whole thing, but more than 30 million people taking an interest in what's going on.
So I'm very excited to say that we have with us now Maria Jannat from Bangladesh. I think we have Maria to talk about disaster-affected poor women.
How the women affected by the disaster in the village live a miserable life. Women are often subject to sexual harassment due to lack of safe living during flood. Poor mothers cannot keep their young children safe during floods, while flood disaster, while pregnant women cannot ensure their well-being. Women and children are twice as likely to die as men during disaster, and women with disabilities are also at risk. The participation of women in current disaster management committee is negligible. So our security, shelter, clean food, water, medical support, separate toilet facilities, and we need poor fund donor or any NGOs. I propose you. Thank you, everyone.
Let's go to Nina from Canada, who will talk about employment, how employment equity is undermined by self-ID in Canada. I'll turn it over to you, Nina.
My speech has actually been renamed in light of the recent one by the Governor General of Canada, Her Honorable Mary Simon, to "I do not want to say the word hope, eh?" The 1970s was the first decade Indigenous adults could vote in Canada, and laws regarding clothing were ended. In the 1980s, Canada enacted the Charter of Rights, basically our Constitution, and I was within the first generation of Canadian women who graduated to having own rights to ideas, language, expression. And when I began dating in the 1990s, I lost all those rights. It was legal to fire me, it was legal to deny me housing, and marriage equality was a distant dream in the 90s. And in that decade, those who were against marriage equality referred to it as same sex in order to invoke the disgust at gay male anal sex, while proponents of marriage equality used same gender for a neutral term. In the 90s, we were going to show the heterosexuals that they should not have name called all those decades ago by calling ourselves queer to avenge our olders and elders. And we fought for the public square rights, military service, marriage, housing, education, employment, and to be able to have our own lives centered in a non-procreative sexual orientation, which was the reason why marriage was opposed by the religious public in the first place. In the 90s, the International Gay and Lesbian Association, an umbrella group of more than 100 organizations, had to remove pedophile groups like the North American Man-Boy Love Association in order to retain United Nations advisory status. Horrifyingly, many organizations also left in support of them. With the current movement of rather be perverts than TERFs men's rights movements, it needs to be said that trans already had public square rights, and trans rights are not human rights when applied against protected women's rights and accessing children, rather than being applied as against the men who coined the words homo and transphobia at court for defense words of murder. Human rights equality is a hand up, not a leg over. From lived experience that no doubt many will relate to, heterosexual men first claim that all women are bisexual, and when that fails, that the men are lesbians. Those who undergo voluntary eugenics do not differ. When men use the word woman as a slur against other men, and gay men are men. And drag queens demonstrate the same contempt for women as men across ethnicity and across sexuality do. To be clear, lesbian is a non-procreative sexual orientation of attraction between women. People are not clothes and objects are not body parts. And clothing is the best argument against ghosts, but also for ghosting. There is zero excuse within the so-called LGBTQ community, as the Canada phrase is, to name call for a no to social events for dating or that rejecting dating is bigotry and then claim kink has a safe word. Equality rights are offering a hand. There is no right to a leg over. No one has to try to make sure that they don't really like or are not interested in. And given that the Canadian military has had to turn over current and historic sexual harassment files to the Canada Supreme Court, along with the RCMP versus women employees class action, there is no pretending that the women who work in prison are even safe from male colleagues who were not prevented from harming the women in prison, and that women's prisons is for women. And those who are identifying as trans men are not being transferred to men's prisons owing to the admission that they cannot be protected there. So there's no pretending that women are being protected in prison. How many more wrongdoings owing to catering to ideas that render persons lesser, and how many apologies and class actions in individual cases do there have to be? Canada purged the public service from the 1950s to 1992, and that was issued an apology in 2017. And Canadians are now facing the mass grave reality of residential schools. We cannot be naive and fail to connect the historic Inquisition torture methods that continued in the modern day by religion and government in the residential schools. And that actually is where SMBT kink practices are derived from. Victims do not have to cater to abusers' individual self-images and not be the experts of their own experience at court. And worse, therapy that is now kink and SMB centric is the new alien abducted and satanic panic practice offering. There is no excuse to ignore the most human right is to a no. And as for governments, there's no pretense of not knowing. In Canada, in 1995, the Employment Equity Act was enacted to ensure that the population was reflected in hiring statistics. The four groups in reverse of the usual order: number 4, indigenous; number 3, disabled; number 2, visible minority; and number 1, women. This was to confer protection to the rights of those who previously had fewer rights or no rights at all. When Gay and Lesbian began to get court case wins and had one military service, the government did not add Gay and Lesbian to employment equity. They created a 5th program called diversity in order to not say the words gay and lesbian. The softest way I can explain how bigotry works is this. At 3 of the employment equity groups, men are at the table and women make the coffee. And at one of the employment equity groups, white heterosexuals are at the table and the other ones make the coffee. And at the Gay and Lesbian Committee, we brought our own lattes and worked together across the table. Now, what this has to do with self-identification, those who caused the oppression that required employment equity to be needed then complain about employment equity, claiming there's no merit, that it's unfair to hire based on addressing wrongs. Well, what does lack merit is self-identification, claiming to be indigenous, claiming to be disabled, claiming to be a visible minority, and claiming to be a woman not only undermines the rights, but removes the protection of rights. And regardless of any air quote sincere belief, end air quote, transgender claims lack merit on its face and requires others to ignore own ordinary senses. And if you have a right to anything, it is to rely on your own ordinary senses. Between religion, arguing that biology is up to students who may not question religion, to medicine's poor track record on women's health care, that medical science is apparently leaving biology up to one patient group. This is where English is an insufficient language, and I have no other or words for this. In 2007, the Harper government removed equality from the status of women, reduced that department from 17 offices to 5, which resulted in the loss of federal funding to nonprofit groups across Canada, and most women's centers closed before the human rights complaints by trans, and then the cities then started requiring the women's groups to include men or not get city funding, as Vancouver, British Columbia seemed to be ground zero, with first Vancouver Rape Relief having funding taken away. And also there's the Vancouver Women's Health Collective. And this is a group I volunteered for in the 90s, and I returned in 2021 to learn that the board had been taken over. And I use the word advisedly, cultural side has occurred. 50 years of women's health information was shredded. And this year, the city celebrated a no low barrier self-ID space where once upon a time, there used to be a crisis and information center. So this is where I do not want to say the word hope, eh? It is a word recently spoken by Her Honorable Mary Simon, Governor General of Canada, at the 1-year anniversary of public awareness of residential schools, mass graves of children. I had a happy childhood. At less than 5 years of age, I evaded a not related adult bisexual male who dated into the family. And because of that, at the age of 12, when I met and encountered Canada's most notorious and self-named Beast of BC, Clifford Olson, weeks before his arrest, I had a happy childhood. And I worked at the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, as the forms designer and workflow analyst. I updated the ED 301 attending a domestic form, and when the WorkSafe BC asked the RCMP to create 2 forms for victims of violence to get claims, they had proposed 2 forms, one for violence and one for sexual violence. However, I realized that the forms had a problem. And so instead of 2 forms, I created 1 form so that those persons who only experienced violence and were most likely to be male had to fill out the same form and have perspective on their form filling experience, and to ensure that the women who were filling out the forms did not have to fill out 2 forms. I had a happy childhood, and I worked for the federal government of Canada in 8 positions across 7 departments. I've had a decade at the Human Rights Commission appealing my employment situation. And because I had a happy childhood, I was able to do this with forms to address systemic abuses that were, and in my workplace, I was not sexually harassed at my last department. I was bullied short of that. So the Canadian government actually cannot work out any of the class actions or any of the other individual cases regarding that until they work out how far is too far before sexual harassment happens. And I am waiting for a Supreme Court of Canada file number, and I'm hoping this video will help to achieve that, because as I said, I had a happy childhood and I know how awful it was to make the forms that the others had to fill out. Now, I have undertaken several correspondence, including with the previous Governor General, Julie Payette, who has duly resigned. I have written to the Prime Minister Trudeau's office, and his office did forward my correspondence to the Treasury Board, who I have now provided all the reports I have been writing in disability retirement. So that's federal. And for one last little part, there's one more aspect, which is British Columbia. I have written to the city mayor and the BC Public Safety Minister advising that they will have to arrest me for the hate crime of disagreeing with men. And I've explained to them all about cotton sealing and everything else. And I am saying this as a Government of Canada employee. who is named in the the manager's handbook to the Canada Labor Code Part 2. So basically it is approaching another person, women and especially youth, to discuss your body, in particular genitals, is practicing non-consenting kink and is sexually harassing others. So this has to stop, and it's going to have to stop at the federal level and then be rolled out to the rest of the country, because Canada is the nation that most other nations have copied our Charter of Rights. And this is where women have the biggest win on the national stage. So I don't want to say hope, but the Governor General said it. And so I'm saying the word along with her. Thank you.
There's a question for you, which is, are the courts public records and available online in Canada?
Yes, the court records are public. My federal court case from March 2021 is public, and I can, I didn't think to provide the numbers, which is partly why I am talking about it, as I'm between court cases. I'm not currently under a legal do not talk other than the regular government security policy and the Stephen Harper era that added another layer of silencing to the public service that they didn't train me on. Because I was already in retirement disability at that point. The last little bit of legal hope I do have to add is there was a British Columbia Supreme Court case in 2008 on the matter of abortion clinics and bubble zones. A bubble zone is a 6-block, no protesters are allowed around the freestanding abortion clinics in Canada. And Canada's most infamous anti-abortionist, Gordon Watson, who is the younger brother of Sam Watson, who's from the Sea Shepherd Society. Gordon Watson tried to argue at court that his religious ideas overrode the secular law protecting the abortion clinics, and the BC court ruled that his ideas do not override the law. So in that sense, that should be able to be applied to trans, that the idea of one person does not override the legal rights of others, especially not ordinary human senses. And again, is not seeking a hand up to equality, but a hand to get a leg over. And that's not equal rights. And even gay men do not get to pretend that cotton sealing is not a fetish confession. And my little clever ending line was, last century, lesbian was the love that dare not speak its name owing to being illegal, and this century owing to the practice of open fetish. And this is, I just wanted to show, this is the letter I received from the Prime Minister's office, sending my reports over to the Treasury Board. So it is absolutely worthwhile to write to politicians and make sure you put the line at the end. A reply is expected because they're legally obligated to reply to Canadians who are the court of public opinion.
We will now hear from Andrea Nobre from Brazil. She's a journalist, feminist campaigner, and the author of The Grumpy Guide to Radical Feminism and The Grumpy Guide to Motherhood. She'll be talking with us about motherhood in a patriarchal system. Andrea, we'd love to hear from you now.
I was invited here today to talk about The Grumpy Guide to Motherhood, which is my latest book. But, you know, why a book about motherhood? Well, basically, short answer, we are all here because a woman gave birth to us. That's the main reason. But I think I would like to talk a little bit more about the book a little bit later. And shall we talk about motherhood in patriarchy? Because motherhood is mandatory. And because motherhood is mandatory, motherhood is actually at the root of women's oppression, right? Motherhood should not be a struggle. The struggle that it is right now, but it actually is. And motherhood is a struggle because of patriarchy. The thing is that gestating and giving birth to another human being should have been only this potential biological function of the female body that was designed by nature to perpetuate the species. But the reality is that women have their reproductive labor exploited by men in patriarchal systems. And so, getting to my main points here. According to Gerda Lerner, in the creation of patriarchy, the first human communities in prehistory consisted of women and their children, with men scattered around. Women got together because humans developed big brains at the same time that humans, Homo sapiens, developed the ability to walk upright. Bigger brains meant larger pelvis, but walking upright put the female pelvis at an angle that only allowed a certain amount of brain growth in the uterus. So that means that human babies are not born with fully developed brains. An example could be that a baby monkey is born, and immediately, like minutes after being born, the baby monkey can grab and hold on to mommy, and mommy has free hands even to climb up trees. Human babies can't grab, they are born quite helpless. So because of that, women prepared for the arrival of a baby in the past by making pottery to collect and preserve food when the baby would be born and would breastfeed. Women invented baby slings to carry their helpless babies. When climate changes occurred and food was scarce, women observed the growth of the plants and experimented on burying seeds on purpose, creating agriculture to have food available for them and for their growing children. Because women's reproductive labor, it's not only to gestate and give birth. It all comes down to having the baby, helping the baby to survive and grow up to adulthood, to reproductive age. And women create, well, according to Evelyn Reed, in The Myth of Women's Inferiority, all the fundamental technology used later in human history that made way to the creation of civilizations was created by women living in their prehistoric communities. Women created the needle, learned how to use fire, built houses, the basics of chemistry, physics, and culture. And they did all that because humans walk upright and their babes are born helpless. And these were their strategies to guarantee that their children would survive. At some point in human history, men saw this cultural revolution and decided to hang around. Gerda Lerner also says that these early human communities with men around could be classified in 3 types. Groups with creation myths, where women are the creators of life, the creators of humankind, which research proves that the earliest sculptures and paintings all portray pregnant women. In these groups with creation myths, with women being the creators, according to Gerda Lerner, about 75% of men helped with child rearing. Groups with a creation myth where a woman and a man, 50% of men helped with child rearing. And in groups with a creation myth about a man creating everything, only 25% or less of men were involved in child rearing. That's when exploitation of women's reproductive labor actually started. With agriculture, it was children who would be the main force in the crops. When more children were needed because men wanted to make enough food to feed and to store and to trade, men started forcing pregnancy on women in the way they have done with domesticated animals. Finally, when women were landowners because they had children and planted to survive, the cultivated land was inherited by the children of women. So men imposed monogamy to ensure heirs and land ownership. The reality is that this is not a dystopian tale. This is what happened, and this is the root of women's oppression and women are still seen as vessels. This is the exploitation of women's reproductive labor, and we now see this exploitation in what we call mandatory motherhood, with women's solely worth based on their reproductive labor. Article 3 of the Women's Declaration says, reaffirming the rights of women and girls to physical and reproductive integrity. A, states should ensure that the full reproductive rights of women and girls and unhindered access to comprehensive reproductive services are upheld. B, states should recognize that harmful practice such as forced pregnancies and the commercial or altruistic exploitation of women's reproductive capacities involved in surrogate motherhood are violations of the physical and reproductive integrity of girls and women and are to be eliminated as forms of sex-based discrimination. C, states should recognize that medical research, which is aimed at enabling men to gestate and give birth to children, is a violation of the physical and reproductive integrity of girls and women and is to be eliminated as a form of sex-based discrimination. So I was invited to talk about motherhood, and I think this is the base of the root of male oppression, is the exploitation of our ability to gestate. You know, it's not just not an opinion. There are a whole range of research out there which proves that. I do my own research in which female reproductive system and labor is exploited in patriarchy at every turn. And I was also invited here to be a little bit more uplifting in talking about the Grumpy Guide to Motherhood, which is my latest book. So I think because of all that, we must talk about motherhood. Motherhood is so important. We are raising the next generation of humans, leaders, you know, and when everything goes according to plan, motherhood should be easy peasy. But even when everything goes all right, because we live in patriarchal systems, everything can go wrong, you know. And then in the book, the latest book, I try to find at least the funniest bits that women who are going through motherhood in a nice way still can get it wrong, still can all go downhill, and I try to bring funny takes about it. The reasoning behind this book, it's because my second book is The Grumpy Guide to Radical Feminism. I wanted to complete the series with something that mattered to me. And I'm a mother of 2 boys. And there are many, many things. Talking a bit more about the book, what I talk, it's a guide, but it has to be read like a stand-up comedy routine, like The Grumpy Guide to Radical Feminism. Because, you know, I do talk about like pregnancy, well, getting pregnant, pregnancy, childbirth, but then it all goes a bit crazy because I'm going to talk about everything that goes in child rearing that I could think, from newborns to school, to first years of school. So I have a whole chapter on poo, because mothers talk about poo for years on end. We talk about poo, we talk about like all the struggles we have to get children out, to get like many of these things. You can get a lot of mentions about, you know, compulsory motherhood, about patriarchy. I talk about mother activism, you know, so it's supposed to be a light relief in all this madness in a moment in which many legislators are denying mothers the word mother. And I think that's the most misogynist thing that could be happening right now, you know, because we are exploited because of our ability to gestate. And now we are being forbidden from being named as mothers. So for all this craziness, if you have the time, you know, get the books and let's talk about motherhood, because these are, especially mothers, they are some of the most vulnerable groups of people around the world. Mothers fleeing Ukraine in the war, mothers being denied financial independence. They can be denied a job because women might get pregnant. They may be denied jobs because they have children. They may be fired right after getting pregnant, or fired right after coming back to work after maternity leave. They can be denied maternity leave. So we have no choice. We have to talk about mothers. Mothers maybe they are isolated in many places. They are isolated from each other, from other women. You become a mother and become isolated from other women, and you don't have, like, you cannot take your child to some feminist conferences. Not here. Here it's awesome, but like in the past, I saw so much of that, like these feminist conferences. Oh no, we cannot have children, and that's bonkers. Even Filia in the UK, the annual conference Filia, they have childcare. That's important because mothers know what a mother is. Mothers know what it is to raise a child, to give birth, to be pregnant. You know, so our voices are so important in the debate. And like in Brazil, for instance, I'm from Brazil. In Brazil, I hear complaint day after day from mothers about loneliness in motherhood. We hear complaints every single day about mothers are excluded from everything, from decision making, from everything. And mothers are out there trying at least to get places to be with their children. They're trying to be political, and we can be political, and I talk about that in the book as well. So I think it's time for motherhood to take hold in our thoughts from now on in a more thorough way. Thank you.